it's a shame if you don't notice the shift in energy around you. I mean, you can't be oblivious to what's going on around you. And I just like kind of woke up one day like, yo, this is my time. This is my this is my thing. I run this, like nobody can really talk to me. I'm good at what I do, and whatever, I'm ready. I'll shell out anybody. There was just a point where I was just like, yo, I don't give a fuck. I'm ready to take on anything. And that was, I think
that was that moment.
Yeah, that was just that moment. I just made that switch. Like, yo, it's my time for the next however long till I decide it's not, till I decide to stop coming in here and working this hard. Because, I just feel like that's where we're at. And it's not even like, it's more, I say that more to like encourage, like even when we're talking about the playoffs, it's like, yo, sometimes you have to realize like, yo, this is it. It's happening now, and this moment decides the longevity of this whole thing. So, some mornings you gotta wake up and be like, yo, this is my thing, not anyone else's. No one can talk to me.
It's time. On a Christmas afternoon, welcome to the COVID Bowl between the 10 and 3 Ewok Rape and the 11 and 2 Rollo Thomas C. Bundy here, you there. We're going to get into a few things. We're going to talk about Chubb versus Hunt. We're going to talk about 1 seed winners. We're even going to talk about their Week 6 matchup. But first, a little bit about their history. Overall, Eric's record since 2010 is 75 and 69. Paul, of course, came into this league in 2012, so I'll give you Eric's record since 2012. 63 and 54. That's 117 games. Paul's record, since he started this league, is 67, 47, and 3. Paul has 3 ties. Don't tell anybody. This, of course, isn't a predictor of anything. And none of what I'm about to tell you is really a prediction. I'm not going to make a prediction, and I'll tell you why. But it's not a predictor of anything because, of course, different seasons, different players. There are some likenesses between teams and between seasons because we all manage with the same habits, our own particular habits, whether we're aware of them or not. Is their versus record more of a predictor? They played 14 regular season games against one another since 2012. Paul has the edge in that matchup, 9 games to 4. And between the years of 2013 and 2015, Paul won 6 straight games. Is that a better predictor of what's going to happen this afternoon? How about Week 6, the only time that these two faced each other this season? Eric won that matchup 90 to 84. This was a strange week. Alvin Kamara was on a bye. Aaron Rodgers scored 3 points. And George Kittle, who of course is on IR for Eric at the moment, had 16 points. Derrick Henry scored 38. On Paul's side, Nick Chubb was on IR. Delvin Cook was injured. DK Metcalf was on a bye. And Matthew Stafford was Paul's quarterback. He scored 19 points. He didn't even have Herbert. Is that a better predictor of the matchup between these two? No. The answer to all of these three is no. Derrick Henry is Eric's number 1 running back. Alvin Kamara is his second. And Kareem Hunt would probably be his third. Dalvin Cook is Paul's number one. Nick Chubb, for most of the season, has been his second. And David Montgomery made a comeback over the last month or so, is Paul's third. This is an all-star game of running backs. Henry second, Kamara's third, Hunt is ninth, Cook is the first-ranked running back, Chubb is the seventh, and Montgomery is the sixth. An elite game between elite teams. They are structured in the most traditional way that a fantasy team can be structured. Does that mean that they're less creative? Does it mean that they just picked whoever they picked on draft day? It doesn't matter, because any of these decisions could have degenerated at any point of the season. Of course, with Paul, you had Chubb on IR and Dalvin Cook was injured in that particular week. That week 6 matchup is really not a predictor because these teams aren't the same teams. Not like they've matured and they've made it to this point. No, lineups are literally just completely different. Also, what makes it a terrible predictor is the fact that Derrick Henry carried Eric that week. 3 points from Aaron Rodgers, 16 from George Kittle, I told you. And that was really about it. 38 points. Every team is capable of getting saved. And he got saved last week by the Washington defense. Any team is capable of it, but it's an elite team that gets all sorts of victories. Pedro got into the playoffs. Most of Pedro's victories now and over the past 2 to 3 years, if you observe Pedro's final scores, are close margins. He's very consistent with that. Close margins. He doesn't get many blowouts. The great teams get the close wins. They get the bloated wins. They get the balance wins, most of all. But they can also be saved. That makes it less of a predictor. Kind of an equal predictor as their overall records and their records against each other. But it's an all-star game between all-star running backs. They have traditional structure to their teams. Not all teams take the traditional path. Ed, we already know that. But because they've been so practical, they've made it to this point pretty efficiently and just bulldoze their way against the rest of the league. This is the very first time we've had such good teams on either side. We've had 1 versus 2. In 2017, when I beat Jay was not an elite team. I was. I had 10 victories. Jay had about 7. He had more points, but my team overall every week just was a better, consistent, more of a versatile team. This is the first time since 2017 the number 1 seed has won every single year. 2017, Team Bundy. 2018, Orlando defeated Pedro 102-60. 2019, Andy 121-100 over Jay. This year, Paul is the number 1 seed. Is that a good predictor? Maybe. Maybe it is. But most likely it isn't. Because Eric's team's been right there every step of the way. If you want to look at Paul's record, if you want to look at Paul's point total, I would direct you to Eric's consecutive wins. I think having all those victories in a row kind of gives you an advantage over a team that does it over the course of the whole season, because if you can compact 8 victories together like that, then what could you possibly do one particular week when everything goes just right? You know, everything doesn't have to go right for you to win 8 straight games. You could have, again, those performances that are completely different from one another. But I think that's a pretty good indicator that your team has the ability to ignite for many, many points. Speaking of many, many points, a few notable things to mention about these two and their history. In 2014, Paul and Eric had the highest scoring game of all time. I've told you about this game. Paul won 100. And, well, look, let me just put it to you this way. How would you feel if you were Eric and someone told you at the beginning of that week you were going to score 148 points, 148, and you were still going to lose? Paul scored 160 points, obviously making that the highest point total individually for any team in our history. Of course, if we have records of the past seasons, 2009, 2008, and 2007, maybe we would know, but you know, this was a different league. Ed was the then commissioner. I don't know if Ed has any access to any of that, and I think I and the rest of the league would appreciate it if Ed could dig in his email and find it, unless, you know, ESPN just completely deleted it. So 2014, you had the highest scoring game, their only playoff game together since 2012, their only playoff game together. Paul won in the very first round of 2017, 77-60. Is that a good indicator too? Is it a good indicator overall that their history pretty much says Paul wins? Paul's had fewer years in this league, and he has the same amount of championships as Eric. And 2016 being the last time that Paul won, and 2008 being the first time that Eric won. Does that say something? Does Paul have Eric's number because he beat him 9-4? I think that this game is going to be decided in places that you wouldn't expect it to be decided. I think Kareem Hunt versus Nick Chubb is a very important part to this whole entire puzzle. Nick Chubb has missed 4 games this season. Kareem Hunt has played all games. For those of you who don't know, I wouldn't think, maybe one or two of you that listen to this, Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb are teammates, of course, on the Cleveland Browns. Kareem Hunt's played all games. He hasn't gotten COVID. He hasn't gotten injured. He hasn't been caught on camera punching or pushing a woman. That hasn't happened. Their rankings are Nick Chubb 7th, Kareem Hunt 9th. That's overall. Points, 154 for Hunt, 156 for Chubb. A month's less of fantasy work, and Nick Chubb scores 2 more points than Kareem Hunt. Touchdowns, Kareem Hunt, 5. Nick Chubb, 0. Carries, 104 for Kareem Hunt, 165 for Nick Chubb.
Edit. I make many mistakes on these recaps, but it's very important to say that Kareem Hunt has 184 carries. 184 carries.
Yardage, which is perhaps their biggest gap. 793 for Hunt, 931 for Chubb. So what that means is maybe by the end of Sunday or next week, Nick Chubb will have a 1,000-yard season. And I think eventually Kareem Hunt will get there as well. I'm assuming what this means is Nick Chubb gets most of the carries when they're playing. That isn't exactly a predictor for who's going to be who has the advantage there either, because, red zone touchdowns happen. Red zone touchdowns, by the way, were the only reason Eric didn't score 120 or 130 points, because Derrick Henry missed out on a few. If you were watching that game, Derrick Henry missed out on quite a few red zone touchdowns. So Hunt versus Chubb is a very important matchup because, it could be 20-4. I don't think they've had many weeks where it's like 10-8 or something like that. Or maybe it has. I don't know. Except this week, it could be completely one-sided, of course. So that's a very important part to this whole puzzle. The second is on Paul's side. I will not put any emphasis on Delvin Cook versus Derrick Henry. You can't stop them. You can only hope to contain them. I don't know who used to say that on ESPN. I don't know if it was Rich Eisen or Dan Patrick. You can't stop me. I'm trying to remember the voice in my head, but maybe you guys correct me. You can't stop these guys. You can only hope that they score 15, 12, and you walk away like, thank you, sir. You sort of walk away. You kind of walk away the way that Kevin Nash did when John Wick gave him that pardon. I think that was John Wick 2 or 1. I don't know which one, where sort of just John Wick creeped up just right behind Kevin Nash, and he was just like, take the night off, and he was like, thank you, sir, and he walks away. He's like the smartest man in the in the whole the whole entire property of John Wick. That's like the smartest guy. He said, all right, I'm getting the fuck out of here. So you just walk away from Delvin Cook and you walk away from Derrick Henry happy if they score 12 points. But it's right to assume, just always plan for the worst and just assume that they're going to score at least minimum 18 to 22 points or something like that. That doesn't really matter. It's like A and A1, we're splitting hairs, whatever happens there. But David Montgomery is a huge part of this whole thing, because David Montgomery over the last 4 weeks has scored 20, 22, 21, and 27 last week. 146 yards last week. He hasn't done much before that. I think they had a bye, and then he had an injury, and then the weeks 9, 8, 7, and 6, I think he all he had was single digit performances. So he was a different player back then. He was a different player when Paul faced Eric week 6. He had a single digit performance. So Derrick Henry, and not Alvin Kamara necessarily. Not Alvin Kamara, because Alvin Kamara goes out there this afternoon and he could score 15, which is normally where he's been. Again, that only speaks to how good Eric's team is. Remember, Alvin Kamara is the 3rd ranked overall running back. So he's riding bitch only because Derrick Henry's there. Derrick Henry's an outlier. He's not human. He's not performing like a human. And the scariest thing about Derrick Henry that I've noticed, and I just didn't know this particular thing about him, this very fascinating thing about Derrick Henry is, as the game goes along, he literally gets stronger. And that's terrifying. That's why when you're watching Red Zone and Scott Hansen's like going back and forth between games, you just see Derrick Henry walking in there for his 2nd touchdown over the last 15 minutes. That's terrifying. So that little probability, little meter that ESPN is just kind of, they've just injected into their app, which I like. They did it for the playoffs. I hope they continue to do that for 2021 and on. I think you throw that shit right out of the window with this matchup because of those 2 reasons. I bring it back to those guys because it's true. It's just, and consider that, and then consider the fact that Delvin Cook is number 1. It's just they're operating on a different level. I think it's important to look at these 2 teams in that same way. Look at Eric's team as being Derrick Henry and Paul's team as Delvin Cook. If those two went against each other, you're like, who cares? I'm just going to watch. I know I'm just going to watch. So Alvin Kamara is just riding bitch because Derrick Henry's there. That only speaks to how good Eric's team is. Alvin Kamara is just consistently scoring 15 points. That's the beauty. That's the beauty of what he's been this year. I mean, he could, of course, have been the guy that scores 20 or 30. That's not how New Orleans' offense is wired. You know, they mostly depend on Breeze, and it works through Breeze, and Alvin Kamara eats through that whole thing. But all that consistency, you know, today he scores 7 to 8 points. It doesn't really stray far from what Alvin Kamara has been scoring. You know, he's not going to be what number 2 was for me. What number 2 was for me was James Conner, I believe. James Conner, who could, you know, I would be very happy if he scored 15 points. If your number 1 gets you 15, 12, 16, that's good, that's decent, but that's not elite. That's really what Andy had. Andy had a number 1 that's capable of scoring what Alvin Kamara does every week. I'm sure if you look at that Raider running back, whatever the fuck his name is, I'm sure he had a few performances that were in the teens that were very decent. Problem is, that's your number 1, right? But number 1 on this team is riding bitch. So consider that for Eric's team. And consider the fact that if he scores those points, then it's just, that doesn't predict anything about whether Eric wins or loses. But David Montgomery, that's important for Paul. He's carried Paul, you know, he's balanced Paul over the last month or so. And if he's due for what he may be due for, you wouldn't be surprised if David Montgomery's score. Remember, again, I want to remind you, I don't want to get lost on you. Since week 12, 20, 22, 21, 27, if I blindfolded you and told you, well, I wouldn't have to blindfold you. I would just have to tell you, right? Because you're listening to this. If I just told you whose stats were those, and I, you know, said that those were Delvin Cook's stats, you would have been like, well, Delvin Cook's been operating like Delvin Cook. No, that's been David Montgomery, possibly the number 1 running back in fantasy over the last month. Will he continue to be that? If he is, David Montgomery is Paul's MVP. He's Paul's MVP if he gets another 20-something point performance, you know, of his team, because he won this championship for you. Just the addition of how solid he's been has possibly given Paul the edge over Eric. If that happens, it's over. That's what I'm saying. If David Montgomery does what he did, it's over. Because Delvin Cook is going to eat, and Nick Chubb could and probably will most likely outdo Kareem Hunt. So David Montgomery, watch him very closely. And I think he will determine what happens here. And then the secondary thing that will determine it will be the matchup that I've been mentioning. You know, that's all I think I have here. I'll say that although these two are very close in the teams that they have this year, they're very distant in terms of history. Very distant. As I said, Eric 2008, Paul 2016. If Paul loses, then Paul fails to be the 3rd fastest to 2 championships. That's all. That's all that happens. He comes back and, you know, he comes back strong next year and possibly contends for another championship. Eric just got here. He arrived here. From the macro sense, Eric is I wouldn't call him the underdog. I would say Eric is the person with most to lose here, because a loss for Eric is yet another year where he doesn't even separate himself from Pedro and Hensel. All of you are existing within, your own bubbles. Some of us are existing in multiple bubbles. For example, Joe is existing in the bubble of not winning a championship, and he's just there by himself. He is an island. Hensel is operating in a bubble with Joe, because although Hensel has a championship, his regular seasons and Joe's regular seasons are pretty comparable. Hensel is again a part of another group. He is a part of Eric and Pedro, being the 2009 champion. If Eric wins, he separates himself from Pedro and Hensel, and he needs to do that. If he wants to be taken seriously, if he wants to be inducted into the 2-chip winner circle or the multiple chip circle, if you guys don't want me elevating myself above you, but I just am. I can't help it. If you want to be inducted into that group, you've got to get it done. That's it. Paul loses, he is right where he is. He's right in this tier where he's above Ed, he's above Pedro, he's above, I don't know about, that makes it debatable between Andy, because Andy put up the season that he did last year. So it's very debatable. And again, like I said, I think Andy's one championship puts him above everyone who has one chip. But Paul and Andy are pretty much there with each other as far as one chip winners. The fact that Paul makes it to the championship after 4 years does say something. If you just lose, it doesn't just mean like, oh, you just lose. No, you made it to the championship. Making it to the championship is valuable. Jay's made it to a lot of championships over the past 4 or 5 years. He just doesn't win as consistently as Team Bundy does. That's not his fault or anything. He's just not Team Bundy, But this means more for Eric. Paul is playing with house money. He's not playing with house money, when you consider the implication of all of this. If he wins, then he is, a part of that group with Orlando and with Jay. And we can have a conversation next week as to, what that means. But there are no predictions here. There are no assumptions. It's just, let's watch and let's see what happens, and let's hope it's good. So, as always, may your quarterbacks get hurt before they leave the locker room. May your running backs pull their hamstrings, and may your wide receivers get arrested for marijuana possession. Go fuck yourselves.